area in and around Gilgo Beach has been used to discard human remains for some period of time.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. The latest news in the Long Island serial killer case is that Heuermann's defense are pushing back on the prosecution's request for a DNA swab. In addition to that, they seem to be trying to raise doubt that Heuermann ever touched that pizza crust, arguing the cops lacked probable cause. So it seems like we're going to have a Pizzagate after all. If one pushes aside the DNA and the digital data, that's the phone data, as well as a witness describing a 6'4" ogre driving a green Chevrolet Avalanche, is there any other inculpatory evidence that the killer left at the scene? Well, yes, there might be. If you're very interested and invested in the Gilgo Beach serial killer case, and you still haven't subscribed to this channel, you should consider doing so, because this series is going to be ongoing for some time yet. But before we deal with Gilgo Beach victim Maureen Brainard-Barnes, I want to clarify that we're not done with Shannon Gilbert or her sister Sarah. So we will be returning to deal with the Gilbert family for reasons that I'll clarify in due course. I also want to do a mini-series on the JonBenet Ramsey case. I was actually at the Ramsey home in Boulder a couple of weeks ago. Recently, Court TV has been making a mountain of the Gary Oliva molehill, and I think we ought to be asking why, and why now. If I do end up doing multiple episodes, some may be in more of a podcast format. Otherwise, I simply won't be able to cover everything I'm trying to cover. Good news is I did manage to get to the pool and swim a kilometer today. If you're finding the analysis in this episode useful, you can like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So we are dealing with this clue that we all missed, and I think the reason we missed it and the reason why the community missed it was sort of held back for a really long time. And so eventually Suffolk County break their silence. And I think you can ask the question, it's a legitimate question, why did it take so long to catch the Long Island serial killer? Why has this investigation taken such a long time? You could argue that it's 26 years and counting. You could even argue that it's, it might be half of that length of time, but it's still a long investigation. Well, that is a separate narrative in and of itself, full of twists and turns, but basically there's a period where the investigation stalls for a good 9 years, and then something happens. In January 2020, Suffolk County Police Commissioner Geraldine Hart, the first woman to lead the department, decided to release a previously unreleased photo. And by the way, it's Women's Day in South Africa. If there are any women listening, I think a lot of you are. Happy Women's Day from Women's Day in South Africa. I do want to talk about the police commissioner, but first let's talk about this photo. So the photo was released for the first time on January 17, 2020. In other words, this evidence was held back for a really long time. Why? And did it work? And so the photograph was a photograph of a belt with the letters WH or HM embossed on it. At the time, that was January 2020, Commissioner Hart was quoted as follows. She said, "The Gilgo Beach investigation is perhaps the most well-known and complex case this department has ever undertaken." Bear in mind, this was 3 years ago. She said, "It is important that the families of these murder victims know that we remain steadfast in our commitment to deliver justice, and in doing so, give a sense of closure. We do believe that this item, which is a reference to the belt, was handled by the suspect and did not belong to any of the victims." Now, why would she say that? I think certain reasons could be that it is the kind of belt that a man would wear, right? And then the second reason would be potentially that it would be too large for a female. That could be another reason. And so Hart didn't elaborate on why the police were coming forward with a belt, which, again, they'd had in evidence for 9 years. They'd held that back for 9 years. But what the media speculated was that, was it a coincidence that the press conference occurred on the same day that Netflix debuted the trailer for Lost Girls, right? The same day, which is an upcoming film about, at that time, about the mothers of the missing woman, Mary Gilbert, who'd often criticized the investigation. You kind of got a sense that the police department was going to be aware of potential negative publicity, and they wanted to show something. They wanted to show that they had, in a way, made progress when actually they were just showing something that they'd held on to for 9 years. And so, quite rightly, there was some criticism from the Gilbert family lawyer, John Ray, who said via Newsday, they've had this belt for 9 years. Why are they releasing it now? It's nothing but publicity. So what is noteworthy in January 2020 wasn't so much what the police said, but when they said it, and also what they didn't say. They didn't say which victim this belt was connected to, where it was on the victim, or how it was connected. Regardless of the reason for releasing the image or the circumstances surrounding it, nothing came of the release of the photos. January passed, February, March, summer came and went, autumn, back into winter. Almost a full year later, on December 7th, 2020, Suffolk cops released additional photos, or guess what, of the same belt. And so the Suffolk County Police released, now it was 10 years since the realization that it was actually a serial murder, and around about 10 years since the belt had been recovered. And so it had really been 10 years since the fourth victim, Melissa Bartholomew, had been identified, and 10 years since the police had first acknowledged there was a serial killer on the loose. Imagine that, saying, we think there is a serial killer, and then 10 years go by with virtually nothing to show for it. And then in August 2023, a couple of days ago, after 2 more years since releasing those images, and also following the arrest of a suspect, prosecutors finally revealed the relevance of the belt. And I do wonder whether the belt played the same role as knife sheath and knife snap in the Idaho student case, where it was not only an indicator of the perpetrator, and in that case the murder weapon, but also there was this little reservoir of DNA evidence. And is that where they got DNA from this belt, and perhaps even hairs? Now, when they found the belt, they may not have known what they may have gotten DNA off it, but not been able to link it to anything. And then when they did when they did the phone data, and what was the other thing they did? And then they found a suspect, and then they looked at the DNA on the crust. That might be how they realized the significance of that belt. They may have suspected it was significant, suspected that the evidence on it had some significance, but they couldn't link it to anything until the cell phone technology narrowed down a potential suspect. And then the question was, well, is there a link to the suspect? And one of the obvious questions is, what does WH refer to? Now, there has been speculation, is it WH or HM? And this could match the relatives of the prime suspect, Rex Heuermann. The prosecutor said this in August, that it could match relatives of the prime suspect, right? And so that's another possibility, is that they got the relatives' DNA off the belt. That's also possible. And so the interesting thing was that they didn't specify who was the relative. In any event, the belt was one of 3 that was used to tie 25-year-old Brainard-Barnes' feet. So the perpetrator used 3 belts to tie her legs together, her feet, her ankles and legs. And that is what Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney said just a few days ago. And then he was a little cryptic when he said, yes, there was WH or HM on the belt, and the last name is Huerman. There are ancestors with WH, so assign to that what you will. You can see he's been quite careful. He doesn't want to say something and get into trouble. Now, although the district attorney didn't elaborate on which ancestors he was referring to, Huerman did have a grandfather, William Huerman, WH, who died in 1964. Some have speculated, less convincingly in my opinion, that the letters are H and M for Hewer and man. H for Hewer and M for man. But the bottom line is the belt has been referred to as central to possible charges. Then in the same article, it refers to a question hair that is still being tested that was removed by the buckle of the belt, according to Tierney. And he was referring to this belt found binding Brainard-Barnes, who disappeared in 2007. Now, one thing that's curious regarding the belt is the perpetrator in this case is clearly careful and meticulous. It may seem like there's an orgy of evidence, including his wife's hairs on 3 of the victims, and I believe also his own DNA, but if you consider the number of victims and potential victims, a few hairs, and not even his own, is an astonishingly small amount of potentially inculpatory evidence. In this context, the belt seems to be an aberration, either a very clumsy mistake on his part, which seems out of character, or it's not actually related to Huerman. The idea of binding the ankles, feet and legs seems to indicate an intention from the perpetrator to keep his victims alive for a period of time in order to engage with them, perhaps to taunt or even torture them. One has a sense that this occurs in a certain location where they are eventually killed and then transported to another location for disposal. It's also interesting the idea of a belt, which in some households was the favored tool for dispensing punishment by disciplinarian fathers. It may be that this idea of sadism and torture was rooted to some extent in the backstory of these belts. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger has recently revealed that his father, who was a military man, and bear in mind Huerman's father was as well, that Schwarzenegger's father chased down his son with a belt and beat him with it. In fact, it was so severe what Arnold was experiencing that he not only left home, but his homeland, ultimately moving to America. So here we have an analogy for the potential depths of childhood trauma inflicted only by parents, or in fact, in this case, specifically by one parent. Arnold found a way to alchemize pain into discipline and achievement, but not everyone does. And of course, we're talking about extreme amounts of discipline. In terms of the police commissioner, Hart was ex-FBI, and remember the FBI was actually purposefully excluded from the investigation, which is always strange. And she was appointed to a role as commissioner in 2018. I did say that she was the first woman. She remained in the role for about 3 years. She played an important part in moving the investigation forward and bringing a new sort of level of transparency, which we'll deal with in more detail at some point. But we should note, remember what Laura Richards said in that tweet, that the Gilgo Beach investigation was derailed because of male egos. I'm sure there were male egos, but having the first female police commissioner in the role spoils the idea somewhat that it was entirely a man's world and with male investigators who fucked up. On the other hand, some clearly did. There definitely were investigators who have mud on their hands. And Hart stands out as a powerful force for good during her brief tenure. Even so, it was after her departure in 2021, 2 years later, that the case saw real progress, which, as I say, for better or worse, was politically motivated. An interesting side narrative is what motivations caused the case to get stuck. Well, we'll deal with that further down the line. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.